It is my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, the Honorable Louis Freeh. Mr. Freeh is a partner at Pepper Hamilton Law Firm. He is also chairman of the Freeh Group International Solutions, a consulting firm. Early in his career, he served as vice chairman, general counsel, and corporate secretary and ethics officer to NBNA Corporation, a bank holding company. He served as FBI director from 1993 to 2001, and previously as U.S. District Court Judge, Assistant U.S. Attorney, and FBI Special Agent. No stranger to the military, he served as a JAG officer in the U.S. Army. Mr. Freeh currently serves as court-appointed monitor for Daimler AG, Chapter 11 bankruptcy trustee for MF Global Holdings, and an advisor to Millennium Partners LP. Mr. Freeh is also a board member of the U.S. Naval Academy Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Louis Freeh.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, and I'm very, very honored to be here. And thank you for the wonderful introduction. As you can see, I haven't been able to keep a steady job for many, many years. It's a particular pleasure to be here with you today, and I did not preview my remarks with Admiral Miller, but I'm going to be talking about Lincoln, I'm going to be talking about trust, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about leadership. So I'm delighted to be here. I have a wonderful and privileged association with the Naval Academy, 2 sons having gone here. But I also have one foot in the U.S. Army. Not only as a JAG officer, I have a son who's an Army Ranger. And in doing a little research, Admiral, on Mahan, in whose hall we are today, he was born, as you know, in West Point. His father was a professor at West Point and was appointed to the Naval Academy as a third-year student, which was a very unusual move. Jefferson Davis, by the way, was his sponsor, and went on to be one of the great thinkers, one of the great scholar, thinker, leaders for the U.S. Navy. The influence of sea power on history, which invigorated Teddy Roosevelt as a young Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which I can talk about in a little bit, is really something that brings a lot of what we're going to talk about this morning. But this is a wonderful opportunity for you to be in this hallowed place, because it is a hallowed place. If you walk around, as you will for the new few days that you're here, you will see vestiges and legacies and living examples of leadership, of heroism. I think of all the monuments I've seen there over the years, I think probably one of the most moving for me is a monument at Hospital Point at the graduates who have gone on to defend the United States, who are unaccounted for and unfound. And it says a lot about the values and the ethos and the leadership qualities that are reverenced here and recorded. So I'm very, very privileged to be here. I'm going to talk for a little bit. I'm going to give you some insights, and then I'm going to ask a couple of my colleagues to come up so you can ask them questions, not because I want to dodge questions, as I've done frequently in Washington, D.C., but because you'll have the privilege of talking to 3 former Naval SEALs, my law partner, who's a West Point graduate, also a Ranger Hall of Famer, and I think you can connect with them and ask a lot of very good questions. One of the things that I think you need to keep in mind over the next couple of years is the world has always been in crisis since civilization dawned and people started organizing. There's always been crisis. The notion that we have more crisis now than we ever had before is a fallacy, I believe. We have complexities, a lot of which have to do with our technology, the speed of information, the global significance of decisions and changes, But the world has always been in crisis. It's part of our human nature, and it's part of our human experience. And what the world will always find, and find among you, particularly the young men and women in this building, are those leaders of character who will overcome crisis, who will manage crisis, and who will manage change, and who will have what some people call that moment of greatness. And it can happen in a corporate setting, it can happen on a battlefield, it can happen in almost any happenstance where you will be called upon to make a decision, to take an action, or to say no, which is a big part of being a leader. I'm going to talk about that in a few moments. You will have those opportunities, great and small, publicized or private, and those are the things that will manage our crisis, keep our country strong, keep the values that are ensconced in our Constitution and in our national character alive and vital. And a lot of it has to do with trust. Again, I didn't prepare my remarks with Admiral Miller, but if you had to ask me what I thought the single quality of a great leader is, it's trustworthiness. And trustworthiness has a lot of different elements. The most important one, I think, is character. And quoting from John McCain's book, he said, "It is your character, and your character alone, that will make your life happy or unhappy. That is all that really passes for destiny. And you choose it. No one can give it to you or deny it to you. No rival can steal it from you, and no friend can give it to you. Others can encourage you to make the right choices or discourage you, but you choose." One of the things that is most important with respect to the notion of character are its elements. And I was going to start with a very, very short video in the theme of Lincoln, Admiral Miller, which I didn't know you were going to talk about. And it has to do with Ulysses S. Grant. I want to just show you this. It's very short. You can't give a presentation today, by the way, without having a video. So I want you to look at this, and then I want to talk about it for a moment. Please.
By April 1865, Grant's strategy to keep moving south and applying continuous pressure on Robert E. Lee had worked. Grant had broken the siege at Petersburg. Sherman had burned his way to Atlanta and the Carolinas. And General Sheridan had laid waste to the Shenandoah Valley, the Confederate breadbasket. Lee had no choice but to surrender when cornered at Appomattox.
U.S. Grant had experienced defeat in his life in ways most men never had. He'd failed at almost everything he tried. As a result, at Appomattox, when he has imposed the ultimate failure any soldier can suffer, by defeating Robert E. Lee, all Grant could think of was Lee's feelings.
I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought for so long and valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause. Though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought.
Grant's terms allowed the rebels to keep their sidearms and horses for the spring planting. Grant also shared his army's rations with starving enemy troops. And though the surrender was indeed unconditional, Grant allowed Lee to leave Appomattox with his dignity and his sword.
That was the end of Appomattox. The war ended there on a note of reconciliation. And Ulysses S. Grant was the man that struck that note, I guess you'd say. And I think that we should never forget that about Grant.
You know, I confess I didn't know much about Grant a short time ago. I was the person who answered the question wrong, who's buried in Grant's tomb? This was perhaps his greatest moment as a military leader. But there was another moment of greatness, and again, what we call that quiet hour of greatness, where what he did and what he refused to do, defined his character. Again, character being, I think, the keynote part of leadership and trustworthiness. That's not very well popularized. It took me a while, actually, to do some of the research. It was my partner from West Point who clued me into this. But what happened is, after the Civil War, Lincoln, of course, was killed 6 days after the surrender at Appomattox. And the change in the mood in the country was very immediate. The hostility towards not just Jefferson Davis, but the South and the Confederate soldiers and Lee began to escalate and reached a very, very high pitch. And there was great talk about indicting Lee for treason. And a Norfolk grand jury actually returned an indictment for treason against Robert E. Lee. He went back to his home in Virginia, taking care of his invalid wife, and expected to be arrested, expected to be brought to trial for treason. And there was no question but that under the Constitution, he had committed all the elements to constitute the high offense of treason. General Lee, who of course then was the most popular American, heard about this. Lee wrote to him, and General Lee went to his boss, the Secretary of War, and said, "You can't do this. I gave my word to General Lee that he would be paroled and he would be safe and that his troops would be unmolested as long as they adhered to the rule of law and the rules of the United States." The Secretary of War refused to intervene, and the trial was about to proceed. Grant then escalated it to the President of the United States, President Johnson, who was weak, very political, but was completely taken up with this hue and cry to bring not just Davis, but Lee and his top generals, the 5 generals that had been paroled at Appomattox, to trial for treason. And Grant said to the President of the United States, "I gave my word that they would be paroled. And if you proceed with that indictment, I will resign as General of the Army." Johnson was stunned, but also was a good enough politician to know that if Grant resigned, his presidency in its infancy would be compromised and destroyed. So Johnson instructed the Attorney General of the United States to instruct the U.S. Attorney in Norfolk not to proceed on the indictment. It's interesting because there's no historical record that Lee ever knew that Grant interceded and thereby saved his life. The 2 individuals could not have been more distinct. Grant, who you heard, had failed at everything he did except being a soldier. Lee, on the other hand, was a patrician. His wife was a descendant of George Washington. The Custis Lee Mansion, which overlooks Arlington, is the Lee home. Lee was actually offered by President Lincoln the commanding leadership of the Union Army at the advent of the Civil War. Turned it down, and of course, went to the Army of North Virginia. At that moment, at Appomattox, not only did Grant make sure that the vanquished enemy would be protected and respected, but he then took that extraordinary step after the war to ensure that his word was not broken, that his trustworthiness would be preserved, and was prepared to resign for it. One of the best leaderships and examples of leadership that I could imagine, and I think that our history has recorded. And not very well known. Again, great interest in Lincoln, great interest in the Civil War, but not a lot of information about that, but something that I think is a good theme for you to keep in mind over the next few days. The willingness of a leader to say no. We're used to leaders and politicians saying yes. There's a very strong quality of leadership whether you're sitting in a corporate suite or a government conference in Washington or a high-level executive meeting, where the willingness and the ability to say no is a distinct hallmark of leadership, because it goes, as the Admiral says, to trust and trustworthiness. Backing that up is the willingness to resign, the willingness to leave your office, whether you're the head of compliance at a major corporation and you've detected some criminal activity in your company, you report it to your board and your CEO, and nobody wants to pay attention to it because it contradicts and compromises sales and profits. You have to be prepared not only to say no, but you have to be prepared to leave. And if you're in a military situation, in an extraordinary situation, the same thing will apply. And that's one of the keys of leadership. One of the other important hallmarks is, knowing your business and knowing your mission and understanding how your policies actually work. When I was a newly appointed FBI director, I got all my senior leadership together and introduced myself. I had been there before, so they knew me. And I said, what's our policy on diversity? Of course, sitting around the table were all white males. And they said, well, we have a very robust diversity policy. And I said, well, that's good. I said, how many of our G14s plus are minorities? And nobody had the number, which was an indication that this wasn't really on their radar. And I said, well, let me ask you another question. I said, what do we do with agent applicants? Now, this is 1993. I said, who have used marijuana. And they said, Director, we have an absolute strict policy. Anyone who's ever smoked a joint of marijuana cannot be an FBI agent. And I looked at them and I said, well, have any of you ever smoked marijuana? And they looked at me sort of stunned. And I said, okay, well, let me get this straight. I said, our policy is no one who ever smoked a joint of marijuana can be an FBI agent. They said, that's right. It's an absolute policy. And I said, the applicants all know that policy, correct? They said, yes. I said, so how many of those applicants, when they come in to become an FBI agent, lie on their initial application? And they looked at me and they said, we don't know. So I said, we assume, don't we, that many of these young men and women have smoked a marijuana joint at one point or the other? They said, yes. But if they disclose that, we won't hire them. I said, okay, so we have a great policy here. I said, the first act of application to be an FBI agent, in many cases, has to be predicated by a lie. I said, I don't think that's a good policy. So I changed the policy, and I said, if they've smoked a couple of joints of marijuana and they disclose it, we'll entertain the application. I stopped short at selling and dealing, by the way. This was a very controversial and very unpopular decision. Now, no one told me that to my face, but I knew from my good friends around the FBI that this was considered a very, very bad thing. On the other hand, I said, we have to have policies that encourage people to be truthful and honest. If you start your career as an FBI agent with a lie, it's not a good precedent and not a good way to believe what we're doing. And I asked some other questions, and I said, well, what do we do about lesbian and gay applicants? And they said, we treat them like everyone else. I said, well, that's good. I said, the law requires that we do that. I said, tell me about how the process works. They said, well, we start the background application, and if we learn that they are lesbian and gay, we stop the background investigation. I said, okay. I said, what happens then? They said, nothing. We don't resume the background investigation. I said, well, that sounds like a discriminatory policy to me. The point is, you've got to know your policies, you've got to have reasons for your policies, and you've got to exercise decision-making that looks at the larger good and the larger values of institutions that are based on trustworthiness and based on the ability to rely on the people who are making those decisions. So saying no is a big part of leadership. I was once called over to the Secretary of State's office, and the Secretary said, I would like you to deploy your HRT team. This is our FBI hostage rescue team. It's our elite special operations civilian team, which now works hand in hand with special warfare, Delta, and special operations all over the world. And the Secretary said, I had a meeting at the White House this morning. A lot of requests begin with that phrase, by the way, in Washington. They never say who they met with in the White House. And there's a great story where Griffin Bell was the Attorney General of the United States. He was sitting in his conference room, and his secretary came in all excited. He was only there for a week, and she said, General, she says, I have the White House on the phone, quickly. And he turned to her very slowly and said, I don't take calls from any buildings. The request was, could I deploy the HRT team to Bosnia to look for Vlasic and Karadzic, who were two NATO fugitives, two very bad war criminals. So I was over there with the Attorney General of the United States. She had not heard about this before. So I looked at the Attorney General, and she looked at me saying, please don't give an answer right now. And I looked at the Secretary and I said, I'm going to have to consult with the Attorney General, but the answer is no. And she said, what do you mean no? I said, I'm not going to deploy a civilian FBI team, even my HRT team, to Bosnia to look for two NATO fugitives, even if I had jurisdiction, which I don't think I do, but I don't think that's a job that we want to pursue. So she was very polite. She said, I'm going to have to take this up with the White House. That's, by the way, how they close a lot of these meetings. Never heard from her or the White House again. 2 years later, I'm having coffee with the Secretary of Defense, and the story comes up, and he laughs. He said, Louis, they asked me to do that 2 years ago, and we declined. We said it was too dangerous. Of course, that was never disclosed to me when they made the request. One of the things a good leader has to be prepared to do is say no. As Grant said no to his Secretary of War and the President of the United States. And that's part and parcel, I think, of being a leader and keeping that in mind. So as you spend a few days here thinking about these things, you've got examples and you've got legacies here that are absolutely incredible and motivating and empowering in terms of understanding leadership. And one is Admiral James Stockdale. Those of you who will walk around the campus will see his statue, and you'll find out, if you don't know already, that there's a Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership here. Admiral Stockdale, most of you know, but some of you may not, was a graduate here, but shot down as a pilot over Vietnam in early 1965 as the war started. More importantly, in his earlier work as a naval officer, one of the highlights of his career, again, going to character, he was very involved in the famous Gulf of Tonkin incident. If you remember, this was the incident on which the Johnson administration predicated the declaration of war, in effect, against the Republic of North Vietnam, which led to that long and disastrous and costly struggle. Well, he was very involved in that, but for years, he always maintained he had not seen a North Vietnamese gunboat, which of course was the premise of the whole attack. Shot down, senior officer, tortured, kept in solitary confinement for years, kept in leg irons for years, developed a communications system within the prison so other prisoners could hear news, could communicate, could relate information. Many of the prisoners credited their survival with that leadership. At one point, his captors wanted to parade him downtown as a propaganda tool. So he reacted by defiguring himself, beating himself with a wooden stool to such an extent that the captors would not parade him down the main street. And then tried to kill himself, not because he was despondent, but because he wanted to show his captors that he would never submit, he would rather die. The impact of that courage, that leadership, and the trust with which his fellow prisoners held him convinced the North Vietnamese that torture was not going to work, and that these prisoners would not buckle under and submit, and actually stopped many of the very egregious and awful tortures that they were perpetrating on a regular time. Each year, also as part of the Stockdale Center, you probably know this, many of you who are here, I think it's 5 Mids, Admiral, who go to the Holocaust Museum along with Service Academy members from the other schools and study the Holocaust, study the events that happened in early 1933 in Germany and went forward from there. They study it, they write about it, they come back, and then they help mentor the plebe class that goes and visits the Holocaust Museum, a phenomenal activity. And it was interesting because when I was the director, I introduced a program where all of our new agents classes went up to the Holocaust Museum and spent a day there. And my academic folks at Quantico said, we can't spare the day, we got too much stuff to do. I said, well, I'll make a deal with you. I said, if the agents don't like the experience and they give you bad feedback, I'll discontinue it. So the agents, when they wrote it up, thought it was the most important part of the program that was designed to teach them about the responsibilities of police. So we got the archivist there to design a special program showing what the police failed to do in the early months of 1933. Historians actually record the onset of the Holocaust on April 1st, 1933. Interesting, on Wednesday, we're going to mark the 80th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power. Legitimate constitutional rise, given the chancellorship of Germany by a chancellor and a people that were despondent, economically distressed, and were looking for a leader to bring them forward. Yesterday, even in Germany, they marked the Holocaust Memorial Day. And what's significant about that event is a little bit like the war on terror. During the early 1930s, the world, and particularly the United States, was on direct and regular notice that the events that started with Kristallnacht, which started with the burning of books and ultimately resulted in the burning of people, millions of people, began in Germany, and the reaction by the world and the United States was to ignore it, was to leave it alone. It was over there. It didn't affect our vital interests, and there was no need to react, which is another part of the discussion and understanding of leadership. In one particular incident, 900 Jews were aboard a ship called the SS St. Louis that was expatriating them from Germany. The SS St. Louis sailed across the Atlantic with the goal of landing these Jews who had to be rescued in the United States. They were turned away from Cuba. They were turned away from Miami by the Coast Guard, sent back across to Germany, where most of them perished. Avery Brundage, who was the coach of the U.S. Olympic team in the 1933 Olympics, which were staged in Berlin, at the last minute pulled his two Jewish runners from the 200-yard medley because he didn't want to offend his Nazi hosts, and substituted an athlete called Robinson, who later became very, very famous in the United States. So a whole series of things that were done to avoid making what were critical decisions and what was required by leaders of liberty, particularly in the United States, and many other countries, by the way, to intervene. And we saw the same pattern really begin in the early 1980s with respect to the war on terrorism. The attack against the Marine barracks, which most of you were familiar with, in 1983, 241 American military personnel, including mostly Marines, were killed as a bomb attacked the embassy, a bomb that was organized and delivered by Hezbollah, which is an agent of Iran as it is now. The embassy was destroyed. 241 Americans were dead. The reaction of the United States by a Republican president, and you'll see over the years this is not a Republican versus Democratic issue. The reaction of a Republican president was to withdraw United States forces out of the Mideast. That was how we reacted to the attack and murder of 241 Americans. And the attacks against the United States after that proliferated and escalated. Colonel Higgins, a Navy diver, Bobby Steedham, murdered on a tarmac in Lebanon. Mogadishu, Klinghoffer pushed off a ship liner in the middle of the Mediterranean. And these escalated up into the 1980s. You know, when I was director of the FBI, the 1996 attack on Khobar Towers, 19 Americans killed. This was, again, a Hezbollah attack, which means it was an attack from Iran. The attack in 2000 against the USS Cole, which was an al-Qaeda attack, 17 Americans killed, sailors who were going to mess when the explosion hit, a suicide boat ramming the side of a ship. I was over there about 2 days after the attack and watched young FBI agents removing the remains of these young sailors, putting them on a litter, covering them with an American flag. By the time I got back to the United States, the story was no longer in the news. It was no longer a news story in the United States. And in the middle of a presidential election, October 2000, not one of the candidates discussed or debated the issue. It was almost as if it didn't happen. The 1998 attack against our embassies in East Africa, same thing. Americans murdered, a clear al-Qaeda attack, no reaction by the United States. So we fast forward to 2001, 9/11. The country was shocked by what happened, of course, but it shouldn't have been surprised. A little bit like Pearl Harbor, there was no surprise that the escalation was going to result in that kind of an attack. And it was then, of course, when the United States mobilized, when the quote-unquote war on terror began, and we launched an unprecedented military campaign to deal with that. Before that, we were treating terrorism as a law enforcement problem and as a law enforcement issue. And I remember after the Khobar Towers, 19 Americans were killed, and the President of the United States directed us to investigate, and the instructions he gave were very clear: leave no stone unturned to solve this case and bring the perpetrators back to the United States. So we conducted criminal investigation, even though those of us who were doing it said this seems more like an act of war against the United States, albeit a crime under our extraterritorial statute. So we opened up the case, we worked the case. And our friends in the Saudi Mubahith, which is the police force there, had actually captured a group of the perpetrators. This was a cell that infiltrated into Saudi Arabia in March of 1996. The attack happened in June. The cell was captured by the Saudis, interrogated, and they said, yep, we're part of the Saudi Hezbollah. We were trained in the Bekaa Valley by the IRGC, which is the Iranian extraterritorial force. We got our passports in the Iranian embassy in Damascus, and General Sharifi of the IRGC gave us $250,000 to carry out the attack. And the Saudi police said to us, you need to come over and speak to them. We said, of course. But they said, the only way that that will happen is if your president tells our king that this needs to be done. So for many months, we wrote out talking points for the President of the United States. And then the President or the Vice President would meet with the Saudi king or the Saudi Crown Prince. And the request was for FBI agents to be allowed into the prison, which was a big deal, it never happened before, and interview the Saudis who were part of the cell. And after every meeting, the Saudis would come back and said they didn't raise it. We were waiting for them to raise it. It never happened. And then we would go back to the National Security Advisor, and we were always told, well, you know, we'll raise it in the next meeting, we'll raise it in the next meeting. The reality there was the U.S. did not want to confront or deal with the fact that the Iranian government, at the most senior levels, had murdered 19 American airmen. So I said, fine. I said, if you don't want us to conduct a criminal investigation, this looks like a foreign policy issue, it's probably a DOD issue, we'll stand down. And they said, oh, no, absolutely. We want you to conduct a full and thorough investigation. So I'm not that smart, I'm from Jersey City. I said, fine. I said, we'll conduct a full and thorough investigation. So after a frustrating period of time, I called up President Bush, former President Bush, who had appointed me to the bench. And I said, listen, I have a request for you, but feel free to deny it. And he said, what do you want? I said, well, you meet regularly with the Saudi king. He said, of course, I'm going to see him next week. I said, well, could you make a request for me? And he said, what? I said, I need to get FBI agents into the prison to interview the Saudi detainees who were the Hezbollah members. I said, but just so you know, I said, I've been writing talking points for my president and vice president for the last 6 months and nothing happened, and I certainly don't want to put you in a position. George Bush, a Navy fighter pilot, said, I'll be delighted. So he raises the issue with the King of Saudi Arabia. Of course, I didn't advise the administration. And I get a call from the Saudi Crown Prince, who's over in McLean, says, I'd like to meet with you. So I come over, and he says to me, you need to get FBI agents into my prison to interview these detainees. I said, yes. And he said, he turned to his, he picked up the phone, and he called his brother, who's the Interior Minister, good, and says, Director Freeh is going to send some FBI agents over, and they'd like to conduct an investigation. So I then notified the Attorney General in the White House that we were doing this. I didn't add the fact that we had done it through the aegis of President Bush. I didn't think that was relevant. So we sent FBI agents over, and they interviewed these guys. And these guys said, yeah, we're Hezbollah, we're trained in the Bekaa, we work for the IRGC, we got our passports in Damascus, the whole thing, which is the substance of a case. Now we're doing a criminal case. So we're doing the interviews, we give them their Miranda rights in a Saudi prison, the whole 9 yards, right? We come back, we now have an indictable case against 16 Iranians, including people as high as the Deputy Minister of Defense, the head of the IRGC. And I told the Attorney General, she said, well, let's go over and speak to the National Security Advisor. So we go over and we speak to the National Security Advisor, and I tell people, I had a lot of interesting experiences in Washington. This perhaps was one of the most interesting. And I told him what we had. He looked at me, he was a lawyer, trade lawyer, not a criminal lawyer. And he said to me, who knows about this? And it was one of the strangest reactions I had ever gotten. And I said, well, sir, I said, you know about it. The Attorney General of the United States knows about it, and about 50 FBI agents and the Saudi royal family and Mubahir. And he says, well, this is a problem. So I played along. I said, well, what's the problem, sir? He said, the Iranians did this. I said, of course the Iranians did this. I said, we've been telling you that for the last 3 months. He said, well, this was the best line. He says, well, it's hearsay. Hearsay. I said, well, I said, sir, using my former experience, I said, actually, it's not hearsay. Under 8012B, it's an exception to the hearsay rule because it's a statement by a co-conspirator in furtherance of the conspiracy, which he didn't understand. So anyway, they called a big meeting at the Situation Room. That's the room in the White House. And I went over to the room, and I thought the purpose of the meeting was to decide what are we going to do with this issue that now the Iranian government has evidentiary responsibility for murdering 19 Americans. And it was very important to me because I had met with the families. The president told me to meet with the families. So I met with the families. And, you know, you couldn't find a more incredible, stoic, brave, wonderful group of families. And the only thing they said to me is, Mr. Freeh, please find out what happened. And I said, I'll do that. So we had the meeting, and they passed around these papers. So I thought it was sort of an action paper on what we were going to do in response to this information. No, it was a draft press statement, as to how we were going to manage this and downplay the notion that the Iranians had murdered 19 Americans. So I leaned across to one of my colleagues who went to more of these meetings than I did. I said, do these meetings usually run like this? He goes, yeah, all of them, which was quite an interesting event. After the meeting, I was called over to the tank, they call it, at the Pentagon by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And General Shelton, a soldier, was there. And he said to me, he said, Director, just so you know, he said, we back you 100%. Whatever you need from us, let us know. And with that support, only with that support, we ultimately were able to get an indictment. And these guys are fugitives. Someday they'll be brought to justice, we hope. Whatever deal we ultimately make with the regime there, I hope we don't write out the liability of these people. And so it went. So one of the things that you'll all be faced with at different moments, are making choices and making decisions. And the decision I made that time could have got me fired. If I was the president, I would have fired me, by the way, for calling up President Bush, because I later told him, obviously, what had happened. On the other hand, my defense was I was to leave no stone unturned, so I interpreted that quite literally and felt like I had at least a savings clause with respect to that. Couple of quick other notes, and then I'm going to bring my colleagues up for a couple of questions. History is replete with incredible men and women who exercise the qualities of leadership that Admiral Miller talked about very eloquently, and that all of us from time to time, want to emulate. And this particular hallowed ground, from one end of this campus to the other, as you will at West Point and many other places, find living memories and examples of those people. So leadership in crisis or calm, I think it's the same elements. You can't give a lecture without 10 points, right? So my 10 points are the key element I found in my life and experience for leadership is trustworthiness. Trustworthiness. Do you trust the people making the decisions? Are they making the decisions for the common good and the welfare of the country and not for themselves? No surprise that the current Gallup poll rating, favorable rating for Congress is now 9%. 9%. If that's not an institution in trouble, I can't imagine one in terms of leadership. Trustworthiness is got building blocks, as the Admiral alluded to. Character is the first one. We talked about that. Ulysses S. Grant. His real name was Hiram Grant, by the way. Credibility. Empathy, caring about your people. You know, your people will know whether you care about them or not. Whether you're working in a corporate setting or in a military situation, your people figure out very, very quick if you care about them. I know in the FBI, you know, they transfer a supervisor or a leader before the ink is dry on those orders. Of course, they're not ink anymore, they're digital. You know, the agents in the field office where that person is going have already gotten the word. They've called up their colleagues. They know whether this is a good leader or a bad leader before the person even takes the orders home to his spouse or her spouse. Because reputation is very, very immediate, whether you're in the digital age or in the telephone age. Your credibility and your character precede you. And they're very well established. It's hard to change. You can change it, but it becomes almost indelible. So empathy and caring about your people. Listening. You know, so many great leaders don't listen enough. You know, they want to proclaim, they want to send down edicts, they want to formulate and implement policies, but they don't listen. Part of being a good leader, I've found, is listening and getting all the facts. You know, getting all the facts and then making decisions. As Admiral Miller said, you know, not making decisions becomes, for many quote-unquote leaders and bureaucrats in our government and in our corporate world, the MO. If I don't make a decision, I can't possibly get into any difficulty. And that creates a very weak leadership and a very bad culture. Listening and getting all the facts. You know, I don't talk about Penn State much in public, but a big difference between the board at Penn State and the board at Duke University, remember the horrific allegations there, is that the Duke board acted immediately without any facts and ended up, you know, destroying a bunch of young lives disastrously, mistakenly, and tragically. The board at Penn State, to their credit, and the New York Times gave them credit for this, you know, got all the facts first before making decisions. And as leaders, again, whether you're running a business program or a battalion, you got to get the facts. Now, sometimes in crisis, the facts come very hard, very fast. You have to do a couple of things at once, communicate. One of the big pitfalls of leaders are, you know, they want to give answers, and the people who report to them want to give answers. A recent candidate for Secretary of State got into great difficulty because of the imperative to give answers. You know, there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know. I don't know. I'll get the facts. I don't know. I've had clients who've said to me, you know, I want to retain you, and I want to report in 2 weeks. And I look at them and I say, well, maybe I can give it to you in 2 weeks, but maybe I can't. I'll give you a report when I get the facts and I'm comfortable and confident relating them to you. And sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. But you got to get the facts straight. You know, you don't have to be trained as a lawyer to know that whether you're making corporate decisions, you're acquiring a company, you're hiring somebody, you've got to get the facts. And there's an imperative for speed, for success, for numbers, that really militates against the time and care that it takes to get the facts. Taking blame. You know, there's nothing more important for a leader than taking blame. Most of the times, we saw this last week, you know, someone takes responsibility. They say, well, I'm ultimately responsible. Well, sure you are. But, you know, did you do anything wrong? Did you make a mistake? In hindsight, could you have done something better? Very rare, in my experience, that anybody takes blame. In Congress, in 10 years in Washington, I don't think anybody ever took any blame for anything, which is maybe why they're at 9%. You know, I was testifying once, and I was a pretty new director, and I testified a lot. I was in front of 2 judiciary committees, 2 intelligence committees, 2 appropriation committees. When I left, one of my staff members said, "You've testified more than anybody else in Washington," which I didn't take as a great accomplishment. But I was there one day as a new director, and one of the congressmen was lambasting the FBI, and me by implication, for Ruby Ridge, for Waco, and how irresponsible it was of me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my outstanding assistant director for congressional liaison, who was sitting right behind me, Admiral, sent me a note. He says, well, tell him you weren't there, you weren't director yet. So I looked at the note, I crumpled it up, and I gave it back to him. So after the hearing, he says, why did you do that? I said, John, I got 14,000 FBI agents watching this hearing. I said, for what purpose am I going to sit there and say, I wasn't there, it's not my fault? So I didn't think that was a good idea. I didn't like being lambasted, but you've got to be understanding the principle of fault and mistake and not just responsibility. You know, everybody in Washington takes responsibility. Very few people say, you know, I screwed up, I made a mistake, but I learned a lot and I'm going to fix it. A good leader does that almost instinctively. Communicating, leading by example. I mean, these are almost too obvious to mention. Know your mission and your people well. I talked about saying no, and I talked about resigning. When I was offered the FBI job, I turned it down. I said no. I'm very happy as a federal judge. And ultimately, you know, I did take it. But I took it under reluctant circumstances. I made that known. And I didn't do it intentionally for this reason, but I found after I got there that it really enhanced my independence. I was in the job for about 2 weeks. My assistant director comes in. He says, Louis, I want to brief you on a case. I said, okay. He said, it's called the Madison Savings and Loan Case. I said, all right. So he briefed me on this. This is Whitewater, for those of you who are too young perhaps to remember it. And I stopped him. I said, wait a minute. I said, you just told me we're conducting a criminal investigation of the President of the United States. He goes, no. He says, it's just an SNL case down in Arkansas. And I said, no. I said, we are conducting a criminal investigation of the President of the United States, and I haven't unpacked my boxes. So we opened up a criminal case against the President of the United States. And it changed the relationship very dramatically, in little ways, but significant for some people. For instance, at a certain level in Washington, they give you a White House pass. This is like a big deal. And that means you can go into the White House anytime you want and come out. So now I'm responsible for investigating my boss, which was not a position I wanted to be in. And I didn't want to have unfettered, unrecorded access to the White House. So I asked my secretary to send it back. So every time I went to the White House, I logged in and logged out, so everybody knew where I was, what I was doing. Well, this apparently infuriated the White House, I found out later. I couldn't go jogging with the president. He liked to jog. He wanted me to ride on Marine One. I couldn't do it. And then the worst part was there was a private dinner with Tom Hanks that my wife and I were invited to. And I said to my secretary, under no circumstances tell my wife we're invited to the White House for a 6-person dinner with Tom Hanks. The point was, I had to maintain my independence. I had to be able to be separated from an investigation that was very sensitive and very important. So, being able to take a job, if you can, if you get the opportunity, and have it not as a job that you lobbied for very, very hard, because sometimes in lobbying for a position, you tend to compromise your ability to be independent there, and you don't want to do that. I got a whole bunch of other stuff. I'm not going to waste your time. Great examples for people who said no, besides General Grant. Admiral Stockdale, we just spoke about him. Thomas More, Henry VIII said, I'm now the head of the church, and I'm divorcing my wife, and you're the chancellor, right? You're the Archbishop of Canterbury. You're going to agree to that, right? He said no, lost his head. Copernicus and Galileo. Galileo was a little more crafty. He was Italian. I'm half Italian, so I can say this. Galileo was a proponent of the Copernican theory, which is that the planets went around the Earth, not the opposite, heliocentrism, which was a big deal for the church. It also contradicted Aristotle. I mean, who would contradict Aristotle? So Galileo got in trouble. So they brought him before the Inquisition and made him recant. So the story is he did recant because he didn't want to lose his head as More did. But a great story which just shows the human correctness and instinct to do the right thing. After he was sentenced, he put his head down and muttered to himself, "Eppur si muove," which means, yet it moves. And it wasn't recorded by the scribes, so he spent the rest of his life in jail writing scientific work and not doing anything else. The last thing I want to say before our panel, and if I'm writing on your time, I'm sorry, but very, very important because you're going to be able to see this week as you do your work. There is a lawyer, there is a general named Mark Martins, and if you watch the news or you do your Google, Mark Martins is the chief military prosecutor down in Guantanamo. And as you know, the tribunal process and infrastructure has been infirm from the beginning. Not one case has been adjudicated and appealed. It's a mess. There are people who can't be charged. There are people who could be charged, but they compromised national security information. Nobody wants to take them back. The president wanted to close it in a year. Impossible, because the attempt to try them in Article III courts around the United States was rebuffed by the Congress. Nobody wants Sheikh Khalid Mohammed to be tried downtown in their courthouse. So the Pentagon and the president agreed to have a General Mark Martins become the chief prosecutor. Phenomenal background, West Point graduate, Rhodes Scholar. He got his Harvard law degree along with President Obama, right? You couldn't pick a more perfect proponent for this cause. He served 5 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he was going to go down there and facilitate and also implement and pursue the prosecutions. Well, General Martins, lawyer Martins, looked at the cases and said, you know what? Most of these offenses we can't try. And we can't try them for two reasons. One, they're not international war crimes, i.e. conspiracy is not an international war crime. Material support for terrorism. And the reason I don't want to try these in the tribunal court is the notion of reciprocity. And the reciprocity notion for the military is critical. It means if Admiral Stockdale is shot down in Vietnam, well, Vietnam can try him in a military tribunal for some local crime, denouncing the Communist Party. So there's a very, very small but very defined number of traditional war crimes that are the standard and the minimal types of offenses that are tried. And our military doesn't want to expand that because the reciprocity that they will get in other countries could affect the lives and livelihood of American soldiers, servicemen and women who were captured. So there's a hearing this week, and General Phillips, Martins, has said he's not going to oppose the defense motions to dismiss most of these charges. Now, this is, for the administration and the Pentagon, like a huge tsunami, okay? This is the government prosecutor who's taking a stand based on what he thinks and believes is the right thing to do. It's a tremendous example of everything you're going to talk about. You can actually watch probably the motion on Wednesday when it's made, and it's a huge testament to the military lawyers who have been assigned to this very undesirable task in Guantanamo, of defending who everyone agrees are probably the worst terrorists in the world. But their devotion to the rule of law and their trustworthiness as lawyers and advocates has trumped military protocol, chain of command, probably their careers in many ways, and a great example of what we want to see everyone do as you get out. So, do I still have time for my panel? 7 minutes. We're going to have to ask some good questions. All right, I'll ask my panel to come up here. Thank you all very much for your attention. I wish the Congress would have given me only 7 minutes after my opening statements for questions. Right, Admiral Miller? All right, so what you have is a vast and impressive array of experience. Judge Gene Sullivan, who's a West Point graduate, Army Ranger. He's actually in the Ranger Hall of Fame. He won't tell you that. Ryan Peters, who's a graduate here, an active Navy SEAL. Captain Matt Dolan, former Navy SEAL, a judge advocate, a splendid lawyer. Justin Freeh, who's also a former graduate and Navy SEAL. So I know you've got some very difficult questions. I can't answer anything about Area 51. I'm sorry. Anything else you'd like to ask us or my colleagues, we're happy to answer. We've got some microphones set up there for you.
Somebody's got something.
Good morning.
Hey, good morning. My name's Nick. I'm from University of Pennsylvania. And I've got a question that I can't really direct to either of you in particular, but I'd love to hear your impressions or your ideas. Mr. Freeh spoke about trust and the value of trust in one of the core components of building a good team. And I was wondering, given a scenario where you're going into a very maybe high-intense project or mission or assignment, whatever it may be, and you're working with someone that you've never met before, and let's say you have 5 minutes to get to know this person before you go in on this mission, what kind of a conversation would you want to have with that person in order to build trust?
Good question. I'm going to defer to one of my combatants here.
Let's hear it from the SEALs.
Is your weapon loaded? One analogy I can use, in the past couple of years, United States Special Operations Forces and conventional military at large has been asked to do more work with foreign partners. So say you're getting ready to go out the door on a direct action mission with an Iraqi special operations counterpart, and the guy you're used to working with is late, and he's got his second in command that he's basically bestowed the title of leader for this raid, and this guy shows up, and he has all the troops you've trained with. You've run your foreign internal defense packages and trained at the range with these guys for a couple weeks, but it's a new leader who's going to have ground force control of his Iraqi element. There's no magic conversation you can have in 5 minutes. It's going to give you a baseline idea of this guy's competency. But a phrase that I like to use that I've felt has worked well for me, and I heard my dad mention growing up, is trust but verify. So you respect the rank. This guy's a captain in a foreign counterpart military that we work with and train with. But let's face it, we have every range of possibility to go out the door. We have everything from a blue on green to a friendly fire incident to the most squared away Iraqi counterpart you've ever worked with in your life. So you get as good a feeling you can for this guy, and you keep him in your hip pocket during the operation. Or if it's a civilian setting, you keep a close eye on the guy. Ryan, do you want to expound upon that?
I may think in the same way. The trust but verify is very important. I think specific to your project is you don't prejudge. A lot of the things we did, as Justin said, we had the FBI HRT, we brought females, we brought dog handlers, and the people you look at and say, okay, this person will be good to go, or this person is weak because of this, or this, end up being the better people as you start to gauge. So yeah, there's always that sense of trust because you're not going to move forward without it, because they'll absolutely sense if you're sort of sidelining them or diminishing them anyway. But obviously before you give them the keys to the kingdom, make sure that they're going to reciprocate.
Okay, if I may take we probably don't have a lot of time.
You're like a Washington reporter. You ask 2 questions.
I guess, quick question, is there one thing you would want to know about the person? Like one question you would ask them before you guys go ahead and take action?
Well, the one thought I would say is very powerful words is simply telling the person, I trust you. And once you tell that person, now they realize, okay, there's honesty between us, and now we go forth from here. So I think there's no, in that kind of short, I think you're right, the baseline, and especially when you're talking about the Rangers or the SEALs, when you show up to a helicopter, when you show up to wherever, you trust them just because of their training and their background, and that's where you have to start. I think Ryan's point is real good too, is you don't make any generalizations or stereotypes, you trust them from the get-go.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Varun. I also go to the University of Pennsylvania. This question is directed to you, Mr. Freeh. So you spoke a lot about independence and how you tried to maintain your independence with your job from the Clinton and Bush administrations and arguably from Washington, D.C. itself. And I'm very interested in politics, and I've spoken to many people who've had successful careers in D.C., and they find themselves jaded, and they find themselves losing the idealism that they come into Washington with the hope that they can change a system that's arguably broken. Did you find that the independence that you tried to create for yourself alleviated the potential jadism, if that's a word, that happens when you stay in Washington so long, when you work in this system that's so characteristic of all the characteristics of politics?
Oh, it's a great question. Yeah, I mean, look, independence is, it's a daily commitment and a daily chore in Washington. Now, I did have an advantage as FBI director. We have a term for 10 years, which is designed to give insulation, political insulation to the director. But it's a place where you can very easily get jaded and discouraged. It depends who's on the menu for the day. I mean, there are many senior people in Washington who literally, and Admiral Miller can verify this, I think, and read the paper, and if someone else is in trouble, they have like a sigh of relief in the sense that this will be a good day for me, someone else is being cooked. Judenfreude, the Germans call it. And it's a culture that, many good people don't like. People like Senators Nunn and Cohn and Bradley will tell you that's why they left the Senate. They just didn't want to participate in that anymore. But that's the negative side. The positive side is, good leaders and independent leaders, even in other agencies, can exercise, positive leadership and create the trust that the American people obviously do not have in a lot of their leaders in Washington. So, and that's part of the challenge. It's not something to walk away from and say, well, we'll never fix this, because good people make a difference at a minor level, at a mid-bureaucrat level, at a senior level. But you need more of that. I mean, I think the one quality I saw lacking in Washington was just independence and doing things for reasons that had larger goals and larger good in mind. But that's been the challenge of the government since, the framers. The framers wrote the Constitution, but they wrote it to make a limited government because they didn't trust the central government. So it's a reason to be motivated and not discouraged. But it's a daily chore, and it takes a lot of energy to do it.
Thank you. And at least Senator Bradley could hold his hat on his role in the tax reform bill.
Yeah.
So,
No,
there's that.
We probably have time for one more question. And there's nobody at the microphones. Thank you very much. Have a great week, and nice to see you all.
Do you mind standing up here for
Oh, yeah.
Sir, on behalf of the Naval Academy and the Leadership Conference staff, we'd like to present you with a
Thank you
gift
very
as
much.
a token of our appreciation.
That's great. Thanks a lot. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now we'll be taking a short break. If you'd like to use the restroom, I would go out either doors, and along this hallway to your right, you'd be able to find them at the end. Refreshments are available outside.